A quiet gas station in suburban Charlotte turned into a public humiliation scene. A white cop stepped out of his car, eyes locked like a predator, and he picked the wrong man. No questions, no ID check. He cuffed a black man in broad daylight and barked insults like he owned the street. What he didn't know: that man was a decorated U.S. Army general, and within minutes, the cop's career and reputation began to crumble. Have you seen this kind of thing where you live? Don't stay silent. Drop a comment, because the truth deserves to be heard. Late afternoon in Charlotte, North Carolina, the sun cast long rays on the pavement, washing over the low-roofed homes of the city's western suburbs. The air smelled of gasoline, dust, and heat rising from worn asphalt. Lieutenant General Malik Jefferson had just left a meeting with wounded veterans at the local VA center. He wore a charcoal t-shirt, khaki pants, old sneakers, and a Tuskegee University baseball cap. No uniform, no name tag, no insignia to show this man had once commanded thousands of troops, briefed the president in high-level security meetings, and risked his life to rescue injured soldiers under fire. His black Lincoln Navigator SUV stopped at a gas station on Wilkinson Boulevard, a modest area with few cars passing by. He stepped out, military credit card in hand, eyes glancing toward the blinking fuel prices. Plugging in the nozzle with his right hand, he leaned against the vehicle, eyes distant, a rare moment of peace after a packed week of duties. He had no idea that just 2 blocks away, a patrol car was turning into the station at unnecessary speed. Ryan Maddox, 32, white, buzz cuts, dark sunglasses despite the overcast skies, exited the patrol car as if stepping into his own territory. He eyed the black man beside a luxury vehicle and the somewhat unusual cap, and smirked. He had seen the type before, successful-looking black folks who walked with a certain confidence as if their skin color no longer put them under scrutiny, the kind Maddox believed were dangerous because they think they have right, and today he was going to remind this man of the proper order of things. No siren, no warning, just a cold, commanding bark. Hands off the car. Turn around. Now. Malik turned, calm but clearly surprised. "Excuse me, officer, what's the issue?" Maddox didn't answer. He circled the SUV, right hand hovering near his holster, eyes scanning the interior as if hunting for drugs. "You match the description of a blackmail suspect involved in a carjacking 10 minutes ago." His voice emphasized black more than necessary. "I just left the VA center. I can show my military ID to—" "I don't need your self-printed cards," Maddox snapped, loud enough for bystanders to hear. "Step back, hands high, unless you want to be shot." He drew out the last sentence slowly, savoring his power. A white woman lifting her child from an adjacent SUV paused. An old man at a nearby repair shop frowned. Malik exhaled, slow and measured, as if assessing his own survival instincts. "I'm Lieutenant General Malik Jefferson, United States Army. I'm unarmed, posing no threat, just getting gas." He held out his military ID. Maddox glanced, then scoffed. "A general? Driving a Lincoln? Listen, I don't care if you're a general or a waiter. Here, I'm the law." He clicked the cuffs. "Turn around, now." Malik didn't move. "I'm not refusing to cooperate. I'm asking you verify my ID before—" "Ah!" Maddox lunged, yanked Malik's arm, twisted it behind his back with just enough pain to hurt, not injure, unless he wanted to. "You people always think you're smarter than the law," he hissed. "You think that cap makes you somebody?" He shoved Malik's head onto the hood, hard enough to knock the breath from him. Across the street, a young man began recording. A girl snapped photos, whispering, "Oh God, he didn't do anything." Malik remained silent. No rage in his eyes, no fear, just something else. Bitterness, not for himself, but for a country he once risked his life to protect, now humiliating him through a petty officer drunk on authority. As Maddox scribbled notes like he'd captured a dangerous fugitive, a silver pickup truck pulled into the station. The driver instantly recognized the cuffed figure from behind. His eyes widened, his hand dropped to his belt, not to draw a weapon, but to stop someone from making an even bigger mistake. The pickup truck stopped at the opposite fuel pump. The man who stepped out had a solid build, dark brown skin, and alert eyes. His grease-stained T-shirt read Boone's Auto Service. At first, no one paid attention to him, until his eyes landed on the face being pressed against the SUV's hood. His breath caught for a second. No mistake. It could only be one man. Lieutenant General Malik Jefferson, the man who had saved his life 15 years ago in Fallujah, was now being treated like a liquor store thief. Raphael Boone wasn't one to act impulsively, but this time heat surged through his chest. He walked quickly, without yelling, no flailing arms, just speaking loud enough for Maddox to hear. "Hey, what the hell's going on here?" Maddox turned, frowning like someone whose performance was being interrupted. "Here, step back. Active suspect situation." Boone didn't speak immediately. He took out his wallet and flipped it open, revealing a badge. Raphael Boone, Federal Highway Patrol, North Carolina Civilian Liaison. "I'm asking you again, what's happening here?" Maddox glanced at the badge, then gave Boone a mocking once-over. "Matches the description of a carjacking suspect. Non-compliant. Refused to follow commands." By now, Malik had lifted his head, looking straight at Boone. His face was calm, as always, but Boone knew better. He recognized that look. It was the calm of someone who had faced actual danger, not someone afraid of a badge-wielding bully. Boone took a step forward, not threateningly, but enough to shift the energy. "Lieutenant General Jefferson is not a suspect. He was my commanding officer, and you're making a serious mistake if you think this can be swept under the rug." Maddox scoffed. "Anyone can fake it. There are tons of counterfeit military IDs on the street. You think I'm stupid?" Boone tilted his head. "No, I think you're dangerous. The kind of dangerous that comes from not knowing what you're holding in your hands." Maddox's expression darkened. He turned back to Malik and yanked him toward the patrol car. "Here, I'll verify his ID at the station. If he's really a general, he'll want to cooperate, right?" Boone stepped into his path, voice low and firm. "Let go. You had your chance to verify his identity here and you refused. Now you'll wait. Internal affairs is en route." Maddox tensed, ready to push back, but Malik's silence and Boone's stare made him hesitate. One beat, two, then Maddox unlocked the cuffs with a snap, saying nothing. Malik rubbed his wrists and looked up. Boone asked, "Are you okay?" "I've taken bullets twice," Malik replied dryly, "but I've never felt a chill like being called a suspect in my own country, just because of my skin." Boone turned away, hands clasped behind his back. A hard-to-describe shame rose in him, a shame on behalf of the uniform he still wore. Malik continued, gently, like a reminder. "You're not responsible for people who dishonor it, but if you stay silent, you become one of them." Maddox stepped back, face red, still tense. Boone's phone buzzed. "Internal Affairs will be here in 10. Lieutenant Byrd is coming personally." Maddox heard that and stiffened. Byrd was a known name, one of the few officers openly critical of internal cover-ups. Malik sat on the hood of his SUV. Boone stood beside him. No more words. None were needed. The gas station felt like the calm before a storm. Things seemed quiet, but everyone knew. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was truth. And this time, no one would be able to hide behind standard procedure. Ryan Maddox stood near his patrol car, his hand still tensed near his hip, as if undecided whether to reach for his gun or the last scrap of dignity he had left. Sweat ran down his temple to his neck, despite the absence of sun. He glanced around the gas station. The old man still filming, a mother holding her child staring at him with disgust, and Malik Jefferson, whom he had just handcuffed. In public, now calmly sitting on the hood of his car, wrists bearing the mark of steel, but spine unbent, as if he had never bowed to anyone. Maddox felt uneasy, but he wouldn't admit fault. Admitting wrong was for the weak. That was the professional creed his father, a former police chief in a small southern town, had drilled into him. Once you wear that badge, you never bow to the public, especially not to those who don't look like you. Maddox remembered it word for word. It wasn't advice. It was blood-bound command. And now, under the eyes of a jury of strangers, all he felt was loss of control. His phone buzzed, a message from his captain, "LT Bird is on her way. Do not leave the scene," Maddox cursed under his breath. Jacqueline Bird, the only black officer on the Internal Affairs Board, was the thorn he never liked. Procedural, rigid, no allegiances. She had opposed Maddox's transfer to Charlotte, but senior officers had overruled her due to insufficient evidence of bias, and now she was coming, catching him exposed, surrounded by witnesses. He swallowed hard. For the first time in years, he no longer controlled the narrative. Boone stood beside Malik, eyes fixed on Maddox, saying nothing. Boone felt a mix of tension, shame, and smoldering anger, but he stayed calm, just as the man beside him had taught him years ago. Malik no longer needed to give orders. His presence alone was enough to shake the bravado off the reckless man facing him. Wind picked up. A plastic bag flew across and tangled at Maddox's feet. He kicked it away sharply as if it were the last thing he could still command. He didn't notice what others did, that people were witnessing a white cop losing composure after failing to continue violence without consequences. Maddox stepped to his vehicle, activated the internal radio, and canceled incoming backup. While still marking control of the scene in his report, he wanted to spin the story his way, at least before Bird arrived and seized the narrative. He jotted hurried notes. Suspect showed suspicious behavior, refused initial compliance. Officer requested ID. Unable to verify, third party interfered at waiting superior at scene. He knew every word he wrote could now be dissected, but he still believed that with enough technical phrasing and the right handshakes he could slip through, just as he had before. From Flagler, where he'd been accused of excessive force on a Latino teen in his own backyard. From Georgia, where he was investigated for striking a homeless man with a baton. Cleared because the body cam malfunctioned. From post after post that quietly reassigned him like a headache passed along. But this time was different. There were cameras, a fellow cop as witness, and a man whose name the entire country would know in less than an hour. Maddox wasn't thinking about the gas station anymore. He was seeing the future. Disciplinary hearings, legal calls, the phrase "suspended without pay" in an email. He didn't know that view counts were soaring online, or that a hashtag General Jefferson was now trending, that reporters had received anonymous tips. A U.S. general was cuffed at a gas station just for being black. Maddox still thought he could get away, but what he didn't know was that Jacqueline Bird, now less than a mile away, had already watched the 38-second video clip. She didn't need more verification. She was coming to confirm just one thing: who would be uncuffed and who would be unmasked. The gas station was more tense than ever. Maddox stood off to the side, still holding his notepad, eyes scanning constantly, as if any sudden movement could let him reclaim the control he had just lost. Boone stood between him and Malik, not in a threatening stance, but the way he stood, hands behind his back and eyes steady, made him impossible to ignore. Malik still sat on the hood of his SUV, as if the whole ordeal was happening somewhere far away, but his eyes that had seen battlefield smoke and fire, missed nothing, not even a twitch in Maddox's breath. In the distance, tires screeched softly on pavement. A black, unmarked SUV rolled in, stopping precisely between two fuel pumps. The door opened. Jacqueline Bird stepped out. She wore plain clothes, a white shirt, tailored pants, leather shoes with pointed toes. But every step she took made it clear. She was here to end this. For the first 3 seconds, Bird looked only at Malik. She confirmed his identity with her eyes, then turned to Maddox. "You the reporting officer?" Maddox inhaled, trying to regain his composure. Suspect matched a bolo description. Failed to comply, couldn't present valid ID. I followed standard safety protocol. Bird didn't respond. She turned to Boone. "Preliminary report?" Boone nodded. "I arrived to find Lieutenant General Malik Jefferson, valid military ID, cuffed and forced against the hood. I requested an ID check. Officer Maddox refused to uncuff him, Until I had to intervene. Bird turned to Maddox. Did you examine the military ID before applying force? Maddox bit his lip. I wasn't sure it was real. Have you received training on how to distinguish real from fake military ID? Maddox didn't answer. Bird's voice dropped slightly, each word sharp as a scalpel. Lieutenant General Malik Jefferson commanded Operation Crescent Shield in 2007. He holds Tier 1 security clearance at the Department of Defense. And you handcuffed him in public like a corner store thief. Maddox began to sweat in earnest now, Bird continued. There are at least 3 witnesses filming this incident. The footage has already reached Internal Affairs. I've seen it, and I can confirm your behavior does not align with any protocol currently endorsed by the Charlotte Police Department. Malik stood. He said nothing, just nodded slightly to Bird. She met his eyes for a moment, a silent thank you for the calm no one else could have maintained in such circumstances. Boone stepped forward. Do we need to escort the general to the station? Bird shook her head. No, but Officer Maddox, yes. She pulled out her phone. Send a cruiser to Wilkinson gas station. 1 officer needs to be taken into custody for administrative holding. No cuffs, just standard procedure. Maddox opened his mouth to speak, but Bird raised her hand. 1 more word, and you'll be charged with obstructing an internal investigation. Boone stood still. He knew this moment would come, but not this quickly. Maddox looked around. Now no one pretended not to see. The old man filming, the mother with the child, 2 mechanics from across the street, all watching Maddox like he was the last guard of a regime already fallen. He wasn't unmasked by fists, but by eyes and truth. When the cruiser arrived, Maddox didn't argue. He just lowered his head and climbed into the back seat like the countless suspects he'd wrongly tagged before. Malik stepped toward Boone. I'm fine, but you should be ready. This isn't over. Boone nodded. I know, but at least this time we have proof, and someone willing to speak up. Malik gave a faint smile. You didn't have to speak up for me. Boone replied without hesitation. I didn't speak up for you. I spoke up for myself, because if I stood there and said nothing, I wouldn't be the man you once taught me to be. The wind stirred again. The air was still heavy, but something had shifted. Not laws or policies, but truth. And this time, it had been spoken aloud, clearly, undeniably. As the patrol car carrying Maddox pulled away from the scene, the gas station fell into a moment of silence. No sirens, no shouting, no one was punched or dragged. But the air had just been shaken by a silent explosion. The bystanders didn't leave, not out of curiosity, but because they all knew they had just witnessed something more significant than any evening news could capture. Malik Jefferson stood tall, eyes following the road where Maddox's car had disappeared. His gaze held no anger anymore, just the quiet of someone who had seen too much to be surprised, but still couldn't stop feeling disappointed. Boone was on his phone, delivering a firm, crisp report to his command office. Scene is secure. Lieutenant Bird handled the situation by protocol. Subject Maddox has been transported to headquarters for investigation. Full report to follow within 3 hours. No one questioned why Boone had stepped in, because if not him, then who? An older man in a faded button-down shirt approached Malik. He didn't say a word, just gave a small nod, then walked away, a simple gesture that said everything. I saw, I understand, I stand with you. A young woman, likely in her early 20s, came to Boone and held out her still-recording phone. I filmed the whole thing. If you need it, I'm willing to testify. Boone looked at her, his eyes softening briefly. Keep the original. Internal Affairs will need it. Thank you. She nodded, said nothing more, and walked away. Malik leaned against his SUV door, looking at Boone. Back in Iraq, did you ever see me argue with subordinates? Boone shook his head. Never. You always kept quiet, then did what was right. Malik nodded. Back then, I believed calm could teach more than anger. But sometimes, silence gets misread. People think you're weak, or that you accept it. But really, I was just waiting for someone to notice. Boone gave a faint, incomplete smile. You just made a gas station notice. Malik didn't reply. He opened the car door, but didn't get in right away. His hand brushed the hood, the same spot where his wrist had been slammed less than an hour earlier, as if trying to lift something unnamed. In that moment, from across the street, The sound of a camera shutter echoed. A college student with a backpack and gentle demeanor had taken a photo, not because anyone asked him to, but because it felt right. A veteran standing in ordinary daylight, in an ordinary place, but carrying the weight of an invisible war too many never understood. The student said nothing. He simply posted the photo online with a short caption. He didn't have to shout, but everyone had to listen. And from that moment, what happened at the gas station began to ripple outward, quietly, but unstoppable. That afternoon, the photo uploaded by the student spread faster than any other post that week. No one could quite say why it went viral. Maybe it was the soft light reflecting off the sun-aged skin of a soldier past 50, or the impossibly calm posture of a man who had just been publicly humiliated. The caption was only 8 words. He didn't have to shout, but everyone had to listen. Within 3 hours, the hashtag General Jefferson topped Charlotte's trending list. By late afternoon, it had spread across the state. At the Charlotte Police Department headquarters, Lieutenant Jacqueline Byrd stood in the Internal Affairs office, holding the printed personnel record of Ryan Maddox. She flipped through each page, scanning quickly, not out of haste but familiarity with this kind of file. Bureaucratic language blurred the truth, exhibited excessive intervention in certain search procedures, inconclusive witness testimony, completed retraining on response control. Byrd paused at the transfer section from Flagler County to Charlotte. She remembered one detail clearly. The original file had a yellow flag, requires additional supervision for the first 6 months. But here that section had been erased. The signature? Captain Nolan Kerr, Deputy Director of Personnel. A familiar name, often linked to questionable approvals. Byrd photographed the page and sent it to her personal device. Meanwhile, at the U.S. Army's Fort Liberty Command Headquarters, Coordination Colonel Smith opened his phone to find 4 messages from liaison units, all linking to the video of Malik Jefferson being handcuffed and pinned to a car hood by a white police officer. Smith didn't need to watch it all. He knew that man well. Malik was one of the people who helped him rise to his current position, the man who had once pulled him from rubble in Mosul after their convoy was bombed. He picked up the phone and called the Pentagon directly. "We have a situation. Lieutenant General Jefferson was just treated like a suspect in public, and this isn't something the military can ignore." On the other end, there was no surprise, only one question. "What's the officer's name?" Smith replied. "Ryan Maddox." A pause. Then, understood. Forward all info to the Department of Justice and the Special Military Council. No further comment needed. After the call, Smith sat quietly, eyes fixed on the still image of Malik being restrained. No cries, no resistance, just that silence. The kind that should make the powerful tremble. At a small coffee shop, 10 blocks from the gas station, Boone sat alone, eyes on his laptop, typing up his official report. For the first time in years wearing the uniform, he felt each word carried real weight. No jargon, just truth. The individual was unlawfully handcuffed, despite presenting a valid military ID. Officers' actions lacked verification and ignored requests for identity confirmation. As a witness, I affirm the conduct was inconsistent with standard control procedure. He didn't mention Malik's rank, didn't say Malik had once saved his life. He simply wrote, "A citizen was wrongfully detained." Boone knew that if he leaned on titles, people would call it special treatment. But if he stuck to the facts, no one could deny them. And that, to him, was enough to start change. Meanwhile, at his modest home office on the edge of Charlotte, Malik Jefferson sat in front of his computer. No TV, no newspapers, no social media. His phone kept ringing, texts from old friends, fellow servicemen, former students, even a senator. He didn't reply. His hand rested on his military ID, the same one he'd carried for 17 years since his colonel days. It wasn't a badge to flash, it was a reminder that no matter where he stood, battlefield or gas station, he was still a soldier, and soldiers don't retreat from truth. He closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. Outside, light rain began to fall, but inside him, something had started to shift. Not anger, but a realization. This time, silence would not be enough. That afternoon, the sky over Charlotte hung heavy, like a storm waiting to break. But inside the Charlotte Police Department, the storm had already begun. On the third floor, the usually empty internal meeting room after hours now held 4 people: Lieutenant Jacqueline Bird, Deputy Director of Personnel Nolan Kerr, Administrative Sergeant Diane Murrow, and Officer Ryan Maddox, just returned from the worst escort of his career. Bird didn't sit. She stood, arms crossed, eyes fixed on Kerr. I want an explanation for why Maddox's original file lacks the supervision warning. Kerr, a man in his 50s with silver-rimmed glasses, clasped his hands like he was about to pitch a harmless policy. That recommendation wasn't mandatory, and to my recollection, no formal complaints were ever filed. Bird's expression didn't change, and you don't see a problem putting someone with a record of violent behavior on frontline patrol. Kerr scratched his temple, forcing calm. We were short-staffed. He was the only one available for night shifts in high-risk zones. Sometimes we have to be flexible, Lieutenant. Bird looked at him like she was staring through a dirty window. Flexibility doesn't mean abandoning ethics. She turned to Maddox, slouched in his chair, avoiding everyone's gaze. Do you have anything to say? Maddox's face reddened as he muttered, defensive and agitated. I was following protocol. The subject acted suspicious, didn't present proper ID, and refused to comply with commands. Bird stepped closer to the table and laid down a printed still from the incident video. Do you see this? This is the moment. He holds up his military ID, clear as day. Anyone who's ever seen a real one would recognize it. What did you do? You refused to look. You handcuffed a lieutenant general, in broad daylight with no threat posed, in front of witnesses, because you felt he was suspicious. Maddox's hands clenched. His eyes darted away, then back. He managed one last deflection. Rank doesn't make someone exempt from the law. Bird didn't nod, but her voice sharpened, enough that even Kerr turned his face. True, but rank doesn't strip someone of their rights either, or their humanity. Didn't your training teach you that? She gathered the documents and ended the meeting with a cold, final line. You are temporarily suspended. The investigation starts tomorrow morning. No firearm, no duty, and no appearances at any event representing this department. Her heels echoed on the floor as she left, colder than the words themselves. Elsewhere, Boone was driving home just as the rain began. The radio ran a short bulletin on the case, mentioning Lieutenant General Jefferson by name. The anchor's tone was more serious than any sports update, as if he, too, understood this wasn't a story that would fade in a day. Boone didn't feel triumph or anger. He just sensed something had cracked open, slowly but irreversibly. A fracture in the shield his profession had long used to hide internal handling. That night, in his home, Malik sat at his old piano, the one his late wife used to play. He rested his hands on the keys, not to play, but simply to feel the instrument. Silence filled the room, broken only by rain tapping on the tin roof behind the kitchen. After a while, he pulled out his phone and made a single call. The other end picked up after one ring. Everett? It's me. Yes, I know you've seen it. The voice on the line chuckled softly. I was just about to call you. How are you holding up? Malik looked down at his hand where the cuff marks still faintly lingered. I'm fine, but I need a favor. Anything. There's an officer named Boone. He stepped in at the right moment. Not for me, for what was right. If anyone deserves to be remembered for this, it's him. Everett's tone deepened. You don't want to be mentioned? Malik raised his head. No. I never needed to be seen. I just need someone else to finally see what they usually don't want to. The next morning, the gas station video aired on national morning news. Alongside it, Maddox's name, title, and a snippet of witness testimony. The situation had gone beyond Charlotte, and for Maddox, even if he wanted to step back, there was no way back now. On Saturday morning, Lieutenant Bird's office lights were on earlier than usual. She sat in front of her computer, the blue glow of internal documents lighting her focused face. A newly received file had arrived from the state inspector's office, encrypted with mid-level clearance. It was Ryan Maddox's original personnel file from his time at Flagler County. Bird knew that if this file was complete, the long-ignored questions would finally have answers. She scrolled through section by section. Excessive force during arrest of Latino youth. Complaint filed but no body cam available. Injury caused during restraint. Victim unwilling to cooperate with investigation. Use of racially charged language. No audio evidence. Each line was a red flag. Each red flag, a missing piece in a puzzle the Charlotte Department never bothered to finish. At the bottom was a handwritten psychological evaluation by Flagler's internal doctor. A short note, but chilling, displays hostility toward non-majority populations, reacts aggressively to individuals who appear successful but do not match his personal profile of deserving, recommend regular psychological monitoring. Yet there was no evidence this recommendation had ever been acted on. When Maddox left Flagler, the file was closed, like any routine transfer. With a single signature, Bird zoomed in. The name that appeared didn't surprise her, Nolan Kerr. Meanwhile, in his modest apartment in southern Charlotte, Malik Jefferson was making coffee. He wore dark workout clothes, the same Tuskegee cap still on his head. Under his sleeve, the marks from the handcuffs had begun to fade, but not entirely. On the table was a printed letter from the Department of Defense, a polite confirmation that they would not make a public statement, but that the matter has been forwarded to the National Security Advisor for monitoring. Malik wasn't surprised. The military guarded its silence like a weapon, used only when absolutely necessary, and he understood that. What he wasn't sure about anymore was whether he himself should remain silent. A text came in from Boone. "Are you free this afternoon? I've been invited to an unofficial hearing with the Internal Oversight Board. Seems they need a witness with weight. I'd rather not go alone." Malik read the message and responded with a single word, "coming." That afternoon, in a fourth-floor meeting room at headquarters, Malik walked in beside Boone. No cameras, no press, just 8 people, 4 from the Oversight Board, 2 legal advisors, Boone, and him. No one introduced Malik. No one needed to. One of the board members, a white woman, silver hair, sharp build, began, "Mr. Jefferson, we know you are not a plaintiff, nor have you requested protection, but we would like your assessment, not as a victim, but as someone who has commanded, who understands discipline and authority." Malik didn't stand. He sat straight, hands resting on the table, looking each person in the eye before he began. "I've commanded soldiers younger than Maddox in much harsher conditions, combat zones, sleep deprivation, life or death stress, but I've never seen them lose control the way he did in front of an unarmed, non-threatening man, guilty only of having a skin color he didn't like. That's not individual failure. That's the result of a system that allows people like him to define threat based on instinct, not evidence." His voice was calm. No one interrupted. He continued, slower. "When I presented my ID, he didn't look. Not because he didn't see, but because he didn't want to. And in that moment, I understood something. The scariest part wasn't being suspected. It was being denied the right to explain." Boone didn't speak. He looked down, noticing his pen had snapped in his hand at some point. Malik ended with a line that froze the room. "A cop who doesn't see the truth in front of him isn't blind. He's been taught he doesn't have to look." After the meeting, as the 2 men exited the building, Boone asked, "What do you think they'll do next?" Malik didn't look at him. He simply said, "Depends. They'll have to choose between protecting the department's image or restoring the people's trust. You can't do both." That night, a recording of the hearing was leaked. No one knew who released it, but Malik's final words spread fast, shared tens of thousands of times overnight. And the next day, national networks began replaying the gas station video, no longer as a story of mistaken identity, but as a question. How did a system raise men like Maddox? Monday morning didn't begin with sunrise. It began with a phone call. The Mecklenburg County District Attorney's Office contacted Lieutenant Jacqueline Bird directly. The voice on the other end was low and direct. "We want to see all files related to Ryan Maddox, including field reports and internal documentation, especially the suppressed psychological evaluation." Bird didn't ask who had pushed the request. She already knew. After the leak of Malik Jefferson's hearing testimony, pressure had moved beyond internal affairs. The public knew, and when the public knows, the system is forced to act, not out of conscience, but out of image control. At Charlotte City Hall's communications office, a crisis meeting was underway. The media had stopped merely reporting. Now they were demanding accountability. Headlines no longer read, "Mistaken handcuffing," but asked directly, "Who cleared Maddox? Who erased the warnings? Who's responsible?" In the room, no one had answers, or rather, no one dared say them aloud, because most of them had once shaken hands or looked away. Now, all eyes turned toward one man, Deputy Director of Personnel, Nolan Kerr. At the police department, Kerr sat alone in his office, slumped in his chair, clutching a cold cup of coffee. On the desk, an urgent memo demanding he explain why his signature appeared on a redacted personnel file. He knew there was no excuse, and the worst part, he had believed Maddox wouldn't cause serious trouble. Just another difficult cop. Aggressive, sure, but manageable. He was wrong. His complacency, or rather his arrogant belief that the system would always protect men like him, was now unraveling. At Malik Jefferson's home, the phone still rang nonstop. He'd already declined interviews from CNN, NBC, a human rights panel, and even a congressional invitation. He didn't want to be the face of this, not out of fear, but because he understood that real change couldn't be carried by the image of a retired soldier. It had to come from those still within the system. Boone was different. When invited to a closed-door meeting with the district attorney and internal affairs investigators, he accepted immediately. During the session, the DA asked only one question: "Do you believe Ryan Maddox abused his power?" Boone didn't hesitate. "Yes, and not for the first time." He recounted the gas station incident in full. Nothing added, nothing softened, no moral commentary, just facts. And the truth, in that room, was heavy enough. Later that day, formal statement went out to all news outlets. The Mecklenburg County District Attorney's Office has launched an official investigation into Officer Ryan Maddox for violations of civil rights, abuse of power, and failure to verify identity before engaging in coercive action. Media outlets blasted the news. Within an hour, the gas station video aired again, for the 5th time in 3 days, but now with a criminal charge listed in the corner of the screen. That evening, Boone stood in his backyard, holding a cold cup of tea, eyes on the city skyline. His wife, Delia, came up behind him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "They're going to dig into you now," she said quietly. Boone nodded without turning. "I know, but if I don't do this, I won't be able to look anyone in the eye, especially myself." At the same time, in a cheap rental apartment on the city's east side, Ryan Maddox sat alone on a frayed sofa, bloodshot eyes staring at nothing. His phone was confiscated, his badge gone. He hadn't turned on the TV, but he knew. Everyone knew. There was nowhere to hide. He had believed silence would let things blow over, but this time he was the one being watched, not for doing too much, but because someone finally refused to stay silent. That night, Malik woke up near 3 a.m. He walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and sat at the dining table. On the table was a handwritten note from his teenage nephew. "Uncle, I saw you on TV for the first time. You didn't get angry, but you didn't let it slide. Now I understand what real courage looks like." Malik placed the note in the drawer where he kept his final mission badge. Outside, the city slept. But tomorrow would be different, because the wheels of justice, though slow, had finally begun to turn. The following day opened under a gray sky, but no one paid attention to the weather. All of Charlotte seemed suspended between anticipation and unrest. On local news tickers, The messages rolled non-stop. Officer Ryan Maddox under criminal investigation. District Attorney demands full hiring record review. LT Gen Malik Jefferson declines interviews. The media's focus zeroed in on one point: Malik's silence. No statements, no public rebuttals, no appearances to capitalize on the moment. But Malik didn't need anyone to understand. That morning, he left home early, not in his usual black coat, but in an old olive bomber jacket, its shoulders worn thin. Standard issue for field officers in the early 2000s. He didn't drive to a base or the police department. Instead, he went to a small high school in the city's south side, where Boone's daughter was enrolled. He hadn't called ahead or notified anyone. He just stood quietly at the edge of the school's athletic field, watching students play basketball in the morning mist. A teacher approached, recognizing him, about to speak, but Malik simply raised a hand. No need to do anything. He was just there, a presence, a reminder that some people returned from war not to claim applause, but simply to live as decent citizens again. That afternoon, Boone received an envelope at his desk, no sender name. Inside was a small note. "Thank you for not staying silent, M." He folded the note, placed it in his wallet next to his badge, not as a souvenir, but as a promise. Elsewhere in a northern neighborhood, a 13-year-old black boy named Elijah sat in his room, eyes glued to a clip he had watched more than 20 times. The footage of Malik Jefferson, standing tall at the gas station, not resisting, not backing down. His mother stood silently in the doorway, knowing her son was thinking of his father. Once stopped and searched for driving an old car in a wealthy area. Elijah said little, but that night, he printed a photo from the clip and pinned it to the corkboard in his room. Below it, he wrote in thick black ink, "We don't bow because others forget to look up." At police headquarters, Byrd finalized her report to the City Oversight Council. In it, she proposed a full review of hiring and assignment procedures, especially for cases with signs of redacted behavioral history. The report didn't call Maddox a bad apple. Instead, it placed him in a larger context, a system tolerant of bias, hidden behind formalities. Once submitted, Byrd didn't feel relief, just correctness. Late that night, Malik returned home. He cooked a simple dinner, grilled salmon and steamed vegetables, by himself, as always. Afterward, he stepped into the backyard and sat in the old wooden chair by the worn fence. No one was around, no media, no lenses. In his hand was an unopened letter from a high school where he had once given a speech 3 years ago. Inside was a handwritten note from a student who'd heard him speak and was now a first-year law student. It read simply, "I didn't know who you were when I saw you handcuffed, but after watching you stand tall without bowing, I now know what real strength looks like." Malik folded the letter, placed it on the table, and leaned back. Nothing was over. There would be investigations, hearings, perhaps smears, but in that quiet, in the stillness of his backyard, he didn't feel like a victim or a hero, just a citizen who had refused to let others define who he was. Inside the 3-story concrete building of the Mecklenburg County District Attorney's Office, a closed-door meeting took place, no journalists allowed. Behind the soundproof doors sat 5 figures in dark suits. The district attorney, a communications aide, a senior investigator, and 2 special legal advisors from the U.S. Department of Justice. On the table were stacks of documents, internal memos from the police department, Ryan Maddox's personnel files, the suppressed psychological evaluation, Boone's testimony, a transcript of Malik Jefferson's hearing statement, and printouts from social media platforms where millions had now seen a portion of the truth. No one smiled. No jokes were made. The atmosphere was stripped to its core. If this case wasn't dealt with firmly, the credibility of the entire local justice system could collapse. The issue wasn't whether Maddox was right or wrong. He was clearly wrong. The issue was that he hadn't become what he was alone. He was the product of a system that routinely ignored red flags, so long as the person making mistakes stayed within the lines and out of the spotlight. A system that selected not for integrity, but for connections and media manageable risk. The district attorney, a veteran in the role for 8 years and no stranger to scandal, tapped his fingers slowly on the table. "I don't care who gets burned by this. If we don't clean up our own mess, someone else will use it to burn the whole foundation. I'm moving forward with prosecution. Charges: abuse of power, unlawful restraint, and violation of federally protected civil rights. No objections, no sighs of relief. Everyone knew this was only the beginning. Maddox hadn't acted alone. He'd been transferred, protected, cleared, and that meant others had helped enable him. At noon, Ava Choi, a young investigative journalist at the Charlotte Observer, received an anonymous tip. Look into who approved Maddox file. Hint: the same signature appears in a 2019 internal misconduct case. Camera footage lost due to power failure. Ava didn't waste time. She traced the file, dug through archived reports, and uncovered the pattern. Nolan Kerr, Deputy Director of Personnel, had also been linked to a previous incident involving excessive force by a white officer, an incident that was quietly buried before proper investigation. This time, Ava didn't publish immediately. She cross-referenced facts, verified sources, built a solid case. She knew that once the story moved beyond individuals and toward power structures, there'd be no more tolerance for rookie mistakes. At home, Boone received an email from the department. He was officially invited to serve as a temporary advisor on the task force for internal oversight reform. He hadn't expected it, but he didn't reject it either. Reading to the bottom of the email, his eyes lingered on one line. "We need someone who understands that courage starts with the smallest thing, not ignoring what's wrong just because everyone else does." He didn't reply right away. Instead, he walked outside to the backyard, sat in the chair where his daughter usually read. Some things, he thought, not everyone gets to see. But once you've seen them, Malik remained silent. No appearances, no commentary. But when Boone called to inform him about the advisory role, Malik said only one thing: "Good, but don't let them use you as a shield. You're there to change things, not to help justify what's broken." That same afternoon, in a downtown law office, Maddox's defense attorney read the official summons from the DA's office. He knew his client wouldn't walk free. The question now was whether to plead partially guilty in hopes of a lighter sentence, or build a defense around insufficient training, psychological stress, procedural gaps. These arguments had worked before, but this time, with a highly visible victim, clear video, and truth no longer controlled by internal reports, the lawyer knew this wasn't just about saving one man. It was a trial of the entire system. That evening, an independent TV station aired a 20-minute segment, not dramatic, no suspenseful music, just data. The rate at which black individuals were stopped and ID'd, 3 times higher than whites in Mecklenburg. The number of complaints dismissed without accountability. And a final statement: Maddox is a problem, but he is not the only one. At home, Malik stood before the mirror in his bathroom, silently studying his face. A few new wrinkles on his forehead, eyes a little more tired, but his back still straight, his shoulders didn't slump. He murmured to himself, not to remember, not to repeat, just to hear it clearly. They think silence is weakness, but sometimes silence is the one thing they can't crush. The official investigation had begun, but within the Charlotte Police Department, seasoned officers knew the hard part wasn't dealing with one man named Ryan Maddox. The real challenge was answering a question the system had avoided for years. Why do people like Maddox always find a place? That question now hovered in every meeting room, lingered in the glances of officers who had once stayed quiet, who had witnessed things but never logged them, who had shaken hands to keep it moving. And now, under scrutiny, every past indulgence began to bleed like an untreated wound. Lieutenant Jacqueline Bird sat in her office, reviewing a list of those who had signed off on Maddox transfers from previous departments. Kerr's name was just the surface. Beneath it, a network of familiar names emerged, those who had coordinated placement, recommended exceptions due to staffing gaps, or endorsed special clearance in urgent situations, a system where no one blatantly broke the law, but everyone allowed a little bend. believing no one would ever notice. Bird opened a previously encrypted audio file, a 2021 internal HR meeting she had saved but never shared. In it, Kerr's voice was clear. Maddox is hot-headed, but he's the type we need for rough areas. He can handle those zones. Faint laughter followed. Then another voice. What about those complaints? Kerr replied, no video, no proof. Kids these days are too sensitive. When the recording stopped, Bird said nothing. She forwarded the file to the City Police Oversight Committee with a single line. I can't keep this to myself and still look in the mirror. At a small office in South Charlotte, Malik Jefferson sat with Boone in a rare private meeting. The room was bare, just a ceiling fan, 2 glasses of water, and a whiteboard listing ideas for internal oversight reform. Boone had just taken on the role of advisor to the task force, tasked with reviewing department procedures, something he hadn't imagined even weeks ago. I don't know if they really want change or just want to clean up the optics, Boone admitted. Malik didn't smile. He answered slowly, if you doubt their motives, focus on the results. Don't let disillusionment distract you. Reform doesn't start at the top. It starts with a person who refuses to turn back. Boone nodded and jotted down a few more notes. That same night, Ava Choi, reporter at the Charlotte Observer, published the first article in her investigative series titled Hired Wrong, Shared Blame. Who Let Maddox Slip Through? The article didn't rely on sensationalism. It presented the paperwork, the timelines, the signatures, the recommendations that ignored red flags. Every fact was double-checked. Every name was accurate. Once released, analysts began discussing closed-loop recruitment, the imbalance of internal power, oversight, and especially a culture of silence used to protect jobs, not justice. Meanwhile, Maddox, now summoned a second time, sat in an interrogation room stripped of all bravado. His eyes were dull, not from fatigue, but from the realization that this time he couldn't pull the door shut behind him like before. His lawyer tried to shape a narrative, lack of training, budget cuts, missing post-duty mental health screenings, a police culture that favored force over dialogue, but the oversight board wasn't moved, because now they weren't looking at isolated misconduct. They were studying the entire architecture that allowed such misconduct to thrive unchecked. One member of the board, a former DOJ lawyer, posed a question not found in the official file. Why didn't you look at his ID? Maddox hesitated, then replied softly, almost inaudibly, I thought it was fake. She laid a photo in front of him, Malik Jefferson being welcomed at the White House in 2019. You thought this man was fake? Or did you just never believe someone who looked like him could be real? Maddox lowered his head, for the first time, not to dodge responsibility, but because there was nothing left to defend. Outside, the city of Charlotte carried on, but in every report, every meeting, every glance from those within the system, one truth had settled in. The past can't stay hidden forever, and this time, someone would finally have to answer for the years of silence. 3 days after Ava Choi's article was published, the phone at Malik Jefferson's home rang nonstop. No longer questions about the gas station incident, nor interview requests. Now it was what he dreaded most. Calls for him to become a representative face. Human rights groups wanted him to speak at annual conferences. A national television network proposed a feature documentary titled The Soldier and the Handcuffs. A political organization even offered backing if he ran for state senate. Each invitation came with praise, grand descriptions, words Malik had heard plenty of in the military, but that now felt strangely foreign. He read each email without replying. A few handwritten letters he printed and filed away in a folder, then placed it in the left drawer of his wooden cabinet, the place he reserved for things he didn't want to throw away but had no intention of using. To him, becoming a symbol was dangerous. It allowed people to forget that behind the image was a person, flawed, human, and unwilling to be someone else's vessel for their message. That evening, at his nephew Elijah's apartment, Malik shared a quiet family dinner. The small second-floor unit near the high school was neat, orderly, just like Elijah, who had grown up with Malik after his parents' divorce. Now, a senior in high school, Elijah was reserved but sharp. Throughout the meal, he didn't mention the Maddox incident. It wasn't until they were nearly done with the dishes, Elijah drawing plates by the sink, that he finally asked, "Are you going to respond to any of those invitations?" Malik paused, then answered simply, "No." Elijah didn't push, but he looked at Malik for a long time and said, "I get it, but you know a lot of people don't have anyone standing with them when they're cuffed. No one sees them. If someone like you doesn't speak, a lot of people will think silence is the only way to survive." Malik didn't reply. He stepped beside Elijah, gently placed a hand on his shoulder, and walked out to the balcony. The wind was cold, but not biting. The street lamp cast light across the wall, throwing his shadow long behind him, like someone trying to avoid attention but unable to disappear. Elijah's words stayed with him all night, not because they were right, but because they reminded Malik of something he once promised himself, that if ever he had the chance to change something larger than himself, he wouldn't back away. The next morning, Malik called Bird. "I'll speak," he said, "but not the way they expect." Bird was a bit surprised, but didn't ask why. She simply replied, "I'll make the arrangements." And so, a closed-door session was scheduled at the Charlotte Police Department's training center. No media, no cameras, just over 60 officers, rookies and veterans alike. When Malik walked in, no one stood. He didn't expect them to. He wore no uniform, just a plain gray suit. No pins, no medals. He stood at the center of the room with no notes, no slides. He simply looked at the faces before him, some curious, some guarded, and a few tinged with resentment. He began quietly, "I'm not here to retell what happened at the gas station. You already know. I'm not here to talk about Maddox. I have no need to repeat the name of someone who lost control of himself." The room was silent. Malik continued, "What I want to say is this. The real danger isn't in the wrong that gets done. It's in people starting to believe that wrong is normal, necessary, the price of maintaining order. How many times have you heard that phrase, maintaining order? But what kind of order? One built on victims staying quiet, or one built on witnesses saying nothing? If you've ever seen something wrong and turned away, then I'm sorry. You are part of the problem." Some looked down. A few finally looked up, no longer defensive. Malik didn't scold. He didn't shout. He simply spoke in his steady, deep voice. "I'm not a symbol. I'm not a saint. I'm just someone who stood on battlefields, made mistakes, learned again, and had others teach me the right way, not through rank, but through example. If there's one thing I hope you carry after today, it's this. If tomorrow someone is treated like I was, and there's no camera to capture it, will any of you step forward?" No one answered, but they didn't have to. Sometimes silence is agreement. Sometimes it's the beginning of awakening. After the talk, Malik didn't linger for photos, didn't make side comments. He simply shook Boone's hand, the only person present not just to listen, but to understand. As he left the building, a message from Elijah came through. "I saw the internal live stream. I think today you did exactly what needed to be done." Malik didn't reply, but inside his jacket pocket, his hand curled into a quiet fist, as if to remind himself, this time, he wasn't backing down. 2 days after the internal session at the police training center, a 17-minute video surfaced on an online forum for veterans. No flashy title, no edits, just a shaky phone recording. The speaker's face barely visible, but the audio so clear you could hear each breath. The caption read simply, "Listen to him, just one." The video spread with unexpected speed. Within 36 hours, it was everywhere, on every major platform. Not through the press or any official media channel, but shared like reflex. Not out of sympathy, but because it gave voice to something people had long felt but never known how to say. Black Americans who'd been stopped for jogging in their own neighborhoods left comments like, "Thank you for saying what we've lived with our whole lives." White veterans who had served with Malik wrote, "He once commanded me, no one is more deserving to speak." One Asian American professor posted, "This is the first time I've seen someone speak about justice without needing to raise their voice." In just 3 days, the clip had been shared over 8 million times. Still, Malik didn't appear. He posted nothing, gave no interviews. When a major TV network called to ask for permission to use the footage during prime time, his assistant simply replied, "There are no rights to grant," It was an internal talk. Those who needed to hear it already had. Meanwhile, at the City Police Reform Committee office, Boone sat in a meeting with 6 others, 3 of whom had initially opposed his appointment. No one brought up the video, but the mood in the room had changed. They listened when he spoke. They took notes when he offered proposals, and when he said, "We can't reform a system by pretending its holes don't have names," no one argued. One of his earlier critics, a representative from HR, asked him to coffee afterward, not to befriend him, but because they now knew to keep your position you had to learn to hold your ground the right way. On the military side, the Pentagon released a short, measured statement. It didn't mention the incident directly, but affirmed retired service members retain their value and dignity as when in uniform. Any offense or violation against them in civilian life will be monitored closely by joint legal branches. At the bottom was the signature of the Army Ground Forces commander, a man once trained by Malik. At the federal level, a group of senators began drafting a proposal called the Procedure and Recognition in Arrest, Identification, and Detainment Act, PRAID. It included specific requirements for identity verification, restrictions on pre-verification use of force, and protocols to isolate individual misconduct without allowing it to rot entire institutions. At the press conference introducing the draft, the speaker wasn't a politician, but a former Capitol Security officer, Black, wrongly arrested by local police in 2005. When asked why he supported this law, he answered, "Because for the first time, someone didn't have to shout to make the system stop and listen." That evening, Boone dropped by Malik's home. No reports, no work talk, just a bottle of iced tea and takeout from a nearby Vietnamese restaurant. They ate in silence. No one needed to mention the video. After the meal, Boone asked, "Do you think that video will change anything?" Malik wiped his hands with a cloth napkin, then replied, "I don't think about it. I just know. If some things aren't said when you have the chance, the day may come when you're no longer around to hear them said at all." Boone didn't say more. He looked around the room, at the old photos on the wall, one of Malik with his unit during a 2003 operation, and a bookshelf filled with war novels and well-worn pages full of notes. A man who stood tall without needing a push, and never pushed others down to stand taller. A rare kind of person. And this time, America had stopped to listen to him. After Malik's video spread across every major platform, the Charlotte Police Department officially announced the disciplinary decision against Ryan Maddox. The wording was brief, but colder than ever before. Officer Maddox is terminated immediately due to gross violations of enforcement protocol, abuse of authority, and conduct incompatible with professional ethical standards. No suspension, no probation. Permanent dismissal, with no option for reinstatement. The public wasn't surprised, but inside the force, the signal was loud and clear. This wasn't just about Maddox. Only a day later, the district attorney's office issued another statement, this time launching an investigation into the alteration and suppression of internal assessment data related to Maddox hiring. The first to be summoned was Nolan Kerr. He was no longer Deputy Director of Personnel after a prior closed-door session, but he remained the central figure in a stack of manipulated records. Evidence compiled by Ava Choi, including internal emails, old audio recordings, and testimony from a former employee, was sufficient to initiate administrative disciplinary proceedings. But it didn't end there. In its latest report to the mayor's office, the Special Oversight Board recommended a full audit of all departmental transfers over the past 10 years, not just Maddox. Pressure kept building, and this time, no one could write it off as public overreaction. When major news outlets began raising questions about the accountability of top department officials, from HR chiefs to the police executive board, silence was no longer an option. The current chief of police was forced to speak at a public press conference, where he admitted this system failed to regulate individuals who brought bias into their badge, and the fault doesn't lie solely with them. That statement hit like a punch to the pride of the entire department. But it was also one of the rare moments a leader in law enforcement acknowledged that failure wasn't just about how rules were enforced, but how people were selected and enabled. Some were angry, most understood. If the structure wasn't torn down, nothing solid could be rebuilt. Malik, meanwhile, didn't attend the press conference. He didn't speak. He didn't step near a microphone. He spent that morning at the city library, the same one he used to visit with his late wife every Sunday afternoon. On the second floor, near the glass windows, he reread old civil case rulings involving racial discrimination in law enforcement, not to point fingers, but to find the pattern, the shared origin point, and he found it again. The beginning rarely lies in behavior. It begins in a mindset, quietly legitimized. When someone believes they have the right to assign someone's worth with a glance, without needing a reason. Boone, on the other hand, was consumed with back-to-back reform committee meetings. In one closed-door session, he proposed adding 2 new clauses to the reappointment vetting protocol: mandatory independent psychological evaluation and recurring assessments of implicit bias behavior. There was pushback. Some older members argued that this kind of overmanagement will make officers too afraid to act. Boone didn't back down. He answered plainly, if asking someone who carries a gun to undergo routine mental health checks is too much, then the issue isn't with the protocol, it's with the person holding the gun. The proposal passed, not unanimously, but it passed. And for Boone, that was a crucial step. From now on, certain red flags could no longer be ignored just because he seemed fine. That evening, as the news of Maddox's termination aired across every major channel, Elijah Malik's nephew walked into his room holding his phone. "You saw it?" he asked. Malik gave a slight nod. Elijah sat beside him and said more softly, "I thought it would take a whole year to see any change." Malik sipped his tea, eyes still on the open book in front of him. "Some things need a moment, others need a generation. Our job is to keep the flame alive, even when the wind blows the other way." Elijah said nothing more. But later that night, he went to his room, printed out that sentence, and taped it to the wall opposite his bed. The words, all in black ink, read, "Keep the flame alive, even when the wind blows the other way." And as the city settled after a long day of news, the question was no longer what will happen to Maddox. It was who's next, because this time the price wasn't just one man. It was a whole chain of hands that thought they'd never be touched. When Ryan Maddox was officially dismissed, the public assumed the loudest part of the story was over. But those inside the system knew better. The real storm was only beginning, because once one link is pulled from the chain, the entire chain must be inspected, and this time under public pressure, under the razor-sharp scrutiny of the press, and under the unyielding shadow of Malik Jefferson. Pretending not to see was no longer an option. The mayor's office in Charlotte convened a special hearing, not just to address the Maddox case, but to examine the entire process of recruitment, training, and officer evaluation over the past 3 decades. The hearing wasn't broadcast live, but the guest list was leaked. Boone was among the witnesses. Ava Choi was invited as an independent journalist, and Malik, though not in attendance, was listed as a person who had a significant impact on the hearing's content, a roundabout way of acknowledging that his silence had forced the system to finally speak. Before the session, Boone visited Malik's office to seek his advice. Should I tell everything? About seeing altered records? About officers still active with behavior like Maddox's? Malik didn't answer immediately. He looked at Boone as if trying to see beyond the question itself. Finally, he said, "You can stay silent, but there will be another Maddox who does something worse. And when that happens, someone will ask, who knew and said nothing? If you stay quiet, your name will be on that list too." Boone nodded. He didn't need more reason. He entered the hearing the next day as a witness and left it as the man who peeled back the mask of a decaying system. He recounted exactly what he'd seen, from personnel records being edited before reaching the approval board, to the unspoken orders from superiors. Leave that detail out of the report. Just say appropriate response under the circumstances. He didn't name names, but anyone involved in the chain knew the curtain had been pulled. After the hearing, a team of federal inspectors arrived in Charlotte. No press, no cameras, no formal announcements, just quiet, methodical work, reviewing files, interviewing staff, checking procedures, and, for the first time in years, veteran officers began to feel the presence of something they had long considered abstract, real accountability. Meanwhile, Ava Choi continued her investigative series. This time, it wasn't about individuals. It focused on structural management, analyzing budget allocations marked for advanced training that were instead spent on militarizing the force. One article was titled, plainly, "Not Training, but Arming for the Wrong Mission." The post drew thousands of shares and comments, including one pinned at the top, "They were never taught to understand others, only trained to subdue them." As for Malik, he kept his routines, early mornings, walks through the neighborhood park, a familiar nod to neighbors. People started recognizing him more often. Some approached for advice, to ask his perspective. He never refused, but never lingered long either. One young library clerk once stepped forward and said, "You know, people like me, after what happened with you, we finally felt seen." Malik simply replied, "Don't rely on others to speak for you forever. You've got to be your own voice." The young man nodded in thanks. Malik kept walking. At a weekend press briefing, when asked whether Malik would be honored or awarded by the city, a mayor's office spokesperson replied, "We're considering it." But Malik already knew someone had previously offered him an honorary certificate. He had declined. In his reply, he wrote just one sentence, "I don't need medals. I need people in power to do the right thing when no camera is watching." That same week, during a lecture at Duke University School of Law, a professor asked his class, "Who here believes justice will arrive if we just wait for it?" No one raised a hand. The professor nodded, then projected a single image on the screen. Malik Jefferson at the gas station, handcuffed, looking straight ahead. No caption, no headline. The lecture hall fell completely silent, because no one needed to explain anything. The story of Malik Jefferson had outgrown Charlotte. It was no longer just a case of mistaken arrest or one officer losing control. It had become a symbol, not because Malik tried to make it one, but because the system had gone so long without anyone willing to stand still and force others to look. And when public attention pushed the story onto a bigger stage, Capitol Hill, what had always been inevitable arrived. Justice was dragged into the familiar waters of. At a House Homeland Security Committee hearing, the Maddox case was referenced as a blind spot in enforcement procedures. But instead of discussing systemic causes or meaningful reform, some conservative representatives shifted the narrative. They didn't ask about Maddox, they questioned the public's reaction. Are we turning enforcement errors into weapons to attack entire departments? Asked a congressman from Texas. Another said bluntly, "I see more danger in anti-police culture than in a few bad officers." They didn't say Malik's name, but everyone knew he was at the center. Unspoken, but present in every veiled accusation. In response, progressive lawmakers introduced a sweeping reform proposal, the Malik Jefferson Act for Enforcement Bias Accountability and Evaluation. Nothing extreme. It called for periodic psychological assessments, unconscious bias reviews during reappointment, and mandatory body cam footage for all identity-based stops. But even that was viewed by some political groups as an intrusion into law enforcement authority. Evening news shows started covering the story with polarizing frames. Hero or anti-police tool? Are we overexposing law enforcement? And worse, is Jefferson using his veteran status to push an agenda? Malik heard it all in the nightly news. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't angry, because he understood. Systems of power rarely self-reflect unless forced to. But what did trouble him was how such rhetoric hurt younger minds. His nephew Elijah asked him for the first time, "Doesn't it bother you when they talk about you like that?" Malik simply shook his head. When they can't refute your actions, they attack your motives. That's the fear of those clinging to power. Elijah said nothing more, but for the first time, he understood. Real courage isn't about being praised. It's about staying upright when you're being misjudged. A few days later, a national television program invited Malik to join a primetime debate with a well-known conservative ex-police chief. The offer was tempting, nationwide broadcast, Both sides at the table, Malik declined. In his response letter, he wrote, "I don't speak to win debates. I speak so someone might finally see." While political analysts continued spinning and speculating, Malik appeared at a small gathering hosted by a veterans community. No reporters, no cameras, just about 40 people. Black, white, Latino, a few Native American vets. His speech was short and unpolished. "I'm not here in any official capacity, just as someone who once wore the same uniform you did. I'm not against the police. I'm against the idea that a badge can be used in place of a conscience." The applause was modest, but each clap carried the weight of something rarely heard: truth unfiltered by politics. At the same time, Boone, now an advisor on the Reform Council, was invited to speak before a group of police reps from other states. He didn't mention Malik. Instead, he recalled a patrol last year when a rookie asked him, "What would you do if you stopped the wrong person?" Boone had answered, "I'd admit it immediately. Only cowards fear owning mistakes. A real officer knows to cover up a wrong is to commit a second one." After his talk, someone asked, "Do you think someone like Maddox lasted because he was protected?" Boone replied, "He lasted because too many people saw him mess up and thought, 'Not my problem.'" Afterward, one of the organizers pulled Boone aside and asked, "Does Mr. Jefferson plan to run for office?" Boone laughed and shook his head. "He doesn't want to be anyone's spokesperson. He wants people to speak for themselves." And maybe that's exactly what made Malik so untouchable. He wasn't left or right. He wasn't a party's mascot. He didn't chase applause. He was just the man who once stood at a gas station, not shouting, not bowing, and made the entire country listen. While public opinion remained divided and politicians continued wrestling the story into a political weapon, elsewhere, far from the glare of media lights, a quieter resistance was taking shape. Inside law enforcement circles, there were those who didn't want the reforms to go too far, not because they supported Maddox, but because they feared that if the scrutiny truly widened, too many other Maddoxes would be dragged into the light, and with them, the ones who had signed off, turned away, or patted them on the back. To these people, Malik wasn't a symbol of justice. He was the man who shattered the wall of silence they had spent a lifetime building. A group of mid-ranking officers, those responsible for vetting or approving personnel files, quietly began lobbying to block the proposed unconscious bias screening in reappointment procedures. Their public reasoning was simple: budget constraints, risk of demoralizing internal operations. Official memos used professional language, but in closed-door meetings, they were more candid. If Malik gets glorified, a lot of us will be asked why we let Maddox happen. At a confidential state-level meeting of departmental representatives, a senior advisor bluntly asked, "Are we sure we want to open Pandora's box? The Maddox case is enough. Why dig further?" Boone, attending as a reform delegate, didn't answer immediately. He scanned the room, mostly men over 50, veterans of multiple political cycles, experts in surviving through compromise. Then he replied, not loudly, but clearly, "If what's inside the box is the truth, then opening it is the right thing to do. Keeping it closed just to feel safe comes at a cost, one we won't be able to afford when it eventually bursts open." His words silenced the room for a few seconds. Boone didn't wait for approval. He stood and said plainly, "I'm not here to ask permission. I'm here to remind you that this time, no one gets to forget." Then he walked out, fully aware that some would now see him as a threat. But he also knew, once a sliver of light gets in, no one can pretend it's still dark. At the same time, Ava Choi uncovered a new pattern in the personnel files. She found a group of 19 officers who, over more than a decade, had been transferred from other states under unclear circumstances. Several had complaints tied to them, cases that had been dropped mid-investigation. Digging deeper through addresses, transfer paperwork, and interdepartmental memos, she found at least 3 had been active during Maddox's tenure and had indirect links to Nolan Kerr, yet none had ever been investigated. When she sent this file to a trusted contact at the district attorney's office, the response was a single line: "This is the next case, definitely. But Ava knew the next case would be harder. The deeper you dig, the more you touch parts of the system long believed to be untouchable. And the deeper you touch, the more unpredictable the backlash becomes, especially from those who fear exposure more than punishment. Meanwhile, Malik received an anonymous letter, not threatening but heavy with implication. The sender gave no name, used no insults, but wrote clearly, "You've done something good, but don't push it so far that the entire force collapses. Some things should end at the right time." Malik wasn't angry. He read the letter twice, folded it carefully and placed it in the same drawer where he kept awards, invitations, and thank you messages he hadn't replied to. He understood. When people begin telling you it's time to stop, that's when you know you're on the right path. That night, as the city lay in silence, Malik sat beneath his porch roof, eyes fixed on the dull gray sky. He recalled a training day in Fallujah when a young officer once asked him, "How do you know when to step up and when to step back?" And he had answered, "When doing the right thing starts making the wrong people uncomfortable, that's when you take one more step forward." Tonight, he thought, maybe it's time to take that next step. 8 weeks after Malik Jefferson was handcuffed at a gas station, the story was no longer a crack. It had become a fault line, forcing the entire system to inspect itself. And that same week, for the first time, the silence began coming from the other side. Those who had once attacked Malik on national broadcasts stopped speaking. The voices that had loudly defended the current procedures now softened, pivoting toward internal improvements. The media, losing interest in exposed villains, began looking for the names not yet mentioned. Ava Choi kept digging. One file she uncovered involved an officer accused of shoving an elderly black woman onto the curb during a traffic stop 3 years ago. The case had gone unresolved due to no clear video evidence. That officer was still employed and had been quietly reassigned to an administrative post just days after Maddott's dismissal. Ava submitted a verification request to the district attorney's office. She knew they were overwhelmed, but if no one pushed, that file, buried long ago for lack of evidence, would stay buried. This time, though, she wasn't alone. Boone, still serving as reform advisor, submitted an internal memorandum to the Oversight Committee. He explicitly recommended a review of 7 other cases that resembled Maddox but had never been investigated. His language wasn't accusatory, just direct. Silence due to lack of evidence can no longer justify inaction. The move raised eyebrows among some within the force, but it also spurred those on the fence to step forward. A group of younger officers contacted Byrd, volunteering to join the audit team. They didn't want recognition. They just wanted to make sure that next time, if there's another Maddox, they wouldn't be the ones turning away. Malik heard about it all through Boone. They met at a small cafe in South End, once a woodworking warehouse, now a quiet spot for unguarded conversations. Boone shared updates, how resistance was fading, how closed-door meetings were less closed, how former anti-reform holdouts were quietly withdrawing from key roles. Malik didn't smile or show satisfaction. He simply said, "They're not changing because they believe in it. They're changing because they're afraid." Boone nodded, then asked, "So, is it worth it?" Malik looked him in the eye. "No, but it's necessary, because if we wait for them to mean it, the blood on the pavement will have already dried." Later that afternoon, something unexpected happened. Elijah's high school hosted a dialogue between students and local law enforcement, a first-of-its-kind event. Elijah was the first to speak. He didn't recount his uncle's story. He didn't complain. He simply said, "We don't need police who know how to rap, shake hands, or dance on TikTok. We need them to understand that a wrongly used pair of handcuffs can stay with someone for life, not on their wrists, but in their mind." The room went quiet, and from a corner of the room, Malik, uninvited there, only to observe, looked at his nephew not with pride, but with a quiet recognition. Maybe, finally, he didn't need to speak anymore. That evening, a new notice appeared on the Charlotte Police Department's official website. The Oversight Committee proposes a full review of all unresolved internal complaints from 2010 to present, with support from an independent auditing group. For the first time in the department's history, such a comprehensive investigation had been approved. And it hadn't come from external pressure, but from the internal collapse of a structure long accustomed to protecting itself. Malik read the announcement at 10 p.m. He didn't say a word. He closed his laptop, turned off the lights, and stepped into the backyard. The sky was cloudy, but the wind had lost its chill. The air smelled of rain, of soil, and something harder to name, something that lets you know change was happening, quietly, without slogans, but strong enough that even those once secure in the shadows were starting to glance around, not to check who was watching, but to realize that if they still wanted to exist, they'd need to learn how to stand in the light. That morning, Malik woke earlier than usual, not from restlessness nor in preparation for anything important. Something simply urged him to rise, make coffee, and sit at his desk, as if waiting for a call from nowhere in particular. On the desk lay an unopened letter from the state governor's office, not forgotten, just not needed. It had arrived 2 days earlier, inviting him to a ceremony honoring citizens who have contributed significantly to justice and ethical leadership. The language was polite, perfectly formal, but too polished to feel sincere. He hadn't replied, hadn't declined either, but he had no intention of attending. To Malik, justice wasn't something to be celebrated after cameras had rolled and applause had been earned. It was something you did when no one was looking, and no one thought to say thank you. So that morning, he simply sat and reread an unfinished piece he'd drafted years ago, a letter to young officers. He had once begun it with, "If one day you must choose between what's right and what keeps you aligned with your team, remember your uniform's back doesn't block out the light." Then he stopped and never wrote another word. That afternoon, Bird called. Her voice was tight, not with anger, but urgency. "You should know the internal investigation has now expanded to 4 other departments, including one that temporarily took Maddox in 2018. There may be federal charges." Malik's response was short. "It's finally starting," Bird exhaled, "and some people are blaming you for triggering a full sweep." Malik gave a small laugh. Not bitter, just the sound of someone used to being misunderstood. Good. Blame is the first step toward facing the mirror. That same evening, a group of young officers hosted a closed discussion, optional, off the record, and free of political framing. The topic was simple. What protocol doesn't teach? Speaking when no one wants to hear it. One of the speakers was a female officer, just under 2 years on the force. She spoke about her first time witnessing an unjustified stop. A black elderly man in an old pickup pulled over for looking out of place. No warrant. No real reason, just suspicion. She hadn't spoken up then, and every night since, she saw his face in her mind. "I don't know his name, but I do know this. If there had been a camera that day, maybe I would have pretended not to see, but because there wasn't, I saw clearly that I missed my chance to do the right thing, and that regret, protocol, never teaches you how to carry." A senior officer, nearly 30 years in the field, stood at the back of the room. He didn't mention Maddox. He didn't say Malik's name. He said one sentence that would echo long afterward. "I used to think staying silent was how you protected the force. But now I know silence is just passing the weight down to the next generation." As these stories spread, not through headlines, not by hashtags, something changed without official decree. Internal reports began using clearer language. Subject displayed behavior inconsistent with procedure became officer used excessive force. Preventive compliance became stop conducted without lawful cause. People started using the right words, because now they all understood language wasn't just a shield, it was record, and this time someone was actually reading. That night, Malik sat alone at a small eatery near his old barracks. The owner, Min, a Vietnamese man, placed a steaming bowl of pho in front of him without needing to ask. Malik ate slowly, not out of contemplation or deep thought, just because, for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to rush. At a nearby table, a stranger recognized him. walked over, and extended his hand. No request for a photo, no small talk, just, "I stayed silent once. Because of you, I know I still have time to make it right." Malik shook his hand, didn't nod, didn't speak. Because sometimes the words that matter most are the ones that were never said. 2 months after the incident erupted, major shifts began surfacing, like underground currents breaking through the soil, not in breaking news headlines, but in changes so subtle that they could be missed if unnoticed. And yet, it was these very shifts that proved the ground was truly moving. At the Charlotte Police Department, periodic unconscious bias assessments, once dismissed as formalities, had become two-way conversations. No more multiple-choice quizzes, no more lifeless scoring sheets. Officers were now required to rewrite a real experience, a time they acted on instinct without verifying the reason. One officer shared how he reflexively tightened his grip on the trigger when he saw someone wearing a hoodie at night, even though the person posed no threat. Another recalled pulling over a black woman in a new SUV because he trusted his gut. No one punished them. But for the first time, these admissions were documented, not to assign blame, but to recognize something deeper. Bias doesn't vanish with slogans, but with acknowledgement and the courage to stop hiding it. The head of Internal Affairs, who had once opposed reform, was the first to request independent retraining for his team. He said plainly in a closed-door meeting, "I used to think this was a political tactic. Now I see that if I can no longer see the problem, maybe I've been inside it too long." That statement was never quoted in the media, but it was recorded in internal meeting notes as a turning point. Not for reputation, but because, for the first time, someone had willingly stepped out of their comfort zone. Boone was invited to coordinate pilot reform programs in 3 counties across the state. He didn't accept immediately. Instead, he went to Malik, an unspoken habit by now, for advice. Malik simply asked, "Are you doing this for your career or to spread what's right?" Boone didn't hesitate. "To make sure we don't repeat what was wrong." Malik nodded, "Then go. But remember, you don't need to mention my name anywhere. Doing the right thing doesn't need a host." Boone smiled, lighter than he had in weeks. On the other side of town, Ava Choi wrapped up her investigation series with one final piece. The fragile paper wall when a system learns to tell the truth. She didn't mention Maddox's name, nor reanalyze Malik's story. Instead, she wrote about working with young officers, about old case files that had been shelved due to lack of solid evidence, and how past testimonies were now being reopened, not for revenge, but for response. She described witnessing a retired officer volunteer to explain why he once dismissed a valid complaint. No one pressured him, but when he reread the letter and realized the name of the wrongly detained person matched his own daughter's, he said, "I need to revisit that before I no longer can." Ava ended her article with this line, "We don't need more symbols. We need more ordinary people standing in the right place at the right time." Meanwhile, at home, Malik received a package from an anonymous sender. Inside was a copy of a complaint letter from 2012, a black father's written accusation that his son had been struck in the head by an officer, with no report ever filed. The letter had never been answered. Now it was sent again, with a short note. "I didn't know who you were when I wrote this, but thanks to you, I know now it wasn't in vain." Malik read the letter, folded it carefully, and placed it with other papers he'd kept, not as personal keepsakes, but as reminders. None of this started with him, and it certainly won't end with him. That evening, at Charlotte City Hall, a press conference was held to announce the preliminary results of a 6-week internal audit, more than 800 complaint records reviewed, nearly 60 cases found to have signs of intentional downplaying, delay, or concealment. A portion of those were now under reinvestigation, not due to external pressure, but at the system's own request. Numbers appeared on the screen, but what silenced the room wasn't the data. It was the words of the Oversight Committee chair, normally reserved throughout the case. He spoke slowly and clearly. "If not for what happened that day at the gas station, we might never have looked back. And if not for the silence that followed, a silence that didn't yield or retreat, we wouldn't have made it here." A reporter asked, "Is the city planning any formal recognition for Mr. Malik Jefferson?" The chair simply shook his head. "A man like him doesn't need recognition. But we need to learn how not to forget." And for the first time, Malik Jefferson's name was spoken publicly at an official government event, not with honors, not with a list of accomplishments, but as a milestone, as a reminder that there are people who don't need fame or volume to force an entire system to straighten its spine. When the investigation numbers were made public, the first thing Malik Jefferson thought of wasn't Maddox or even himself, but those who were never recorded, the ones pulled over on the roadside, told, "We have the right to be suspicious," shoved against car windows, cuffed not for guilt but for seeming out of place, the ones with no cameras, no witnesses, no social media to speak for them, only memory, and sometimes a shame that was never there. That morning, Malik drove to a small church on the west side of the city, the same one he and his wife once attended during their early years stationed at Fort Liberty. Pastor Jackson, now in his 70s, recognized him from afar, reached out with a quiet handshake. No small talk. "You remember your old seat?" Malik nodded. He took his place in the third row, where they used to sit together on rainy Sundays. The service began. No one said his name. But in that morning's prayer came an unusual line: "Grant us the courage not only to forgive, but to speak up where silence has reigned too long." After the service, a young man approached, tall, thin, wearing a delivery uniform. He stood before Malik, hands slightly trembling. "I'm Derek. In 2020, I was stopped delivering food. No camera, no one believed me. I thought I'd live with that feeling forever. But because of you, I know now I wasn't crazy. I didn't imagine it. It was real." Malik didn't answer right away. He just nodded, then asked gently, "And now, does it still control your life?" Derek shook his head. "No, but I use it to teach my son that there will be times he won't be believed, and even then, he has to hold on to his truth." Elsewhere in the city, Ava Choi was invited to speak at a regional journalism forum. For the first time in her career, she wasn't asked about reporting techniques, but about the responsibility of the pen when the truth is uncomfortable. She didn't bring up Maddox, but she shared one story few knew. "Once I submitted a piece about an officer who'd caused a complaint to vanish from the system. My editor asked, 'What if we publish and he takes his own life?' I didn't sleep for 3 nights. But on the 4th night, I asked myself, what if the person being silenced was my father, forgotten forever? And I sent it in. Justice doesn't always knock politely." Boone, meanwhile, was preparing for a visit to a neighboring county, one that had shown no clear reform steps since the incident began. He knew there would be resistance, doubt, even isolation, but this time, he wasn't going alone. A group of young officers volunteered to go with him, not to protect him, but to do the work. One of them, who had once stayed silent in the meeting where Maddox's transfer was approved, pulled Boone aside before the van left and said quietly, "I was quiet before. I'm not letting myself be quiet again." On that ride, Boone watched the road ahead. The sky was overcast, no rain, but the air felt dense. No one talked much, but the silence wasn't fear anymore. It was focus. They weren't traveling to prove anything. They were going to lay groundwork, not to tear down the old with noise, but to build something new in quiet resolve. That evening, while sorting through old books, Elijah asked Malik, "Do you think if no one had recorded what happened at the gas station, any of this would have happened?" Malik carefully stacked the books, then replied, "Maybe no one would have known. Maybe they'd say I made it up or overreacted. Maybe I'd file a complaint that got denied. But you know what, Elijah? The important thing isn't whether there was a camera. It's that someone, just once, didn't look away." Elijah nodded and quietly placed another book on the shelf. It was a blank journal, one he hadn't written in yet. But the next morning, as Malik passed by his room, he noticed the first page had been filled. It read, "I won't look away, even if no one's watching." On Monday morning, Malik found a handwritten letter slipped under his door. No return address, just 3 words on the envelope, "To Mr. Jefferson." The handwriting was neat and steady. No trace of haste. His eyes was a folded piece of paper written in blue ink. Brief and direct. "I'm sorry. Not because I was the one who handcuffed you. I wasn't there that day. But I did sit in a personnel transfer review meeting for Maddox. I saw the warning signs, but I stayed silent. I thought my voice wasn't enough. Now I know. Silence was complicity. There was no signature, only a final line. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just needed this out of my chest. Malik read it 3 times, not to figure out who wrote it, but to make sure he hadn't missed anything between the lines. He folded the letter and placed it beside an old photo of his wife at the military base courtyard, as if to acknowledge that, at last, the truth, however late, had finally been faced by someone. Across town, in the office of the Reform Oversight Committee, Byrd received a preliminary report from the team auditing old case files. Of the 317 cases previously closed due to insufficient objective evidence, over 80 showed signs of oversight or biased judgment. A young officer on the review team told her, "You don't need to hunt for clear mistakes, just read the language they used. It's enough." In many reports, phrases like suspicious behavior were listed as the main justification for stopping civilians, especially repeated in cases involving Black or Latin individuals. The word suspicious had become a coded cue for institutionalized bias. Boone also received a letter, not an apology, but a report from a young officer trained under the new reform curriculum. He wrote, "When I read about Mr. Jefferson's case, I didn't feel outrage. I saw myself. I saw the way I've sometimes doubted people just because they walked a little too fast through a quiet neighborhood. I never stopped anyone, but I know if it had been me that day, I might not have checked his ID carefully either." Boone read it in silence, then replied with a single sentence. "Doing what's right doesn't start with perfection. It starts with refusing to continue what you know is wrong." At a small auditorium in Elijah's high school, a regular discussion session was held titled "The Role of the Next Generation in Monitoring Power." Elijah, invited to join, didn't talk about his uncle. He simply presented a hypothetical. If the person being stopped at the gas station that day wasn't a general, wasn't on camera, and said nothing, would any of you here have felt the need to speak up? The room fell silent. After the session, a girl sitting nearby whispered to him, "I think before I wouldn't have, but now I'm not sure I could stay quiet." That night, Malik stepped onto the porch holding a printed copy of the morning's apology letter. He didn't reread it, just let the wind move across it, as if to confirm the weight and presence of something both gentle and heavy. Elijah joined him and asked, "Do you think the person who wrote it really changed?" Malik was quiet for a while, then said, "Belief doesn't matter. If they can carry what they once ignored, then the change has already begun." In a small cafe in a historically Black neighborhood, Ava Choi was meeting 3 former witnesses from long-ignored complaints. One of them, Mrs. Jenkins, 72, had once been stopped by Maddox simply for carrying too many bags. She didn't sue, didn't write letters, but when Ava asked why she wanted to speak now, she smiled gently. "Back then, I thought I was just an old Black woman who would believe me, but now I know. If I don't speak, someone else will rewrite my truth for me." At the police department, for the first time since the Maddox case, groups of officers held voluntary internal discussions. No recording. No transcripts. That day's topic, first response, instinct or bias. One young officer recounted a moment he nearly blew his whistle thinking someone was reaching for a weapon, only to realize it was a man grabbing his wallet. Nothing happened, but the memory stuck. A colleague asked, "If there had been a camera, would you have acted differently?" He answered, "If I only do the right thing when a camera is on, I shouldn't be wearing a badge." Later that evening, Malik received a message from Byrd. "I think we may need to hold a formal series of community forums, not just for victims this time, but for anyone who ever thought it wasn't their business." Malik replied, "You handle the organizing. I'll handle making sure they don't look away." And while Charlotte settled into the night, streets still buzzing with traffic, news stations playing weather and sports updates, in quiet corners of the city, people were writing their truths anew, not waiting for permission, not needing a famous name to lead. They acted because, for the first time, someone had stood tall and made them realize silence was no longer an option. 1 week before Maddox's preliminary hearing, when the media was mentioning the case only as a side note in the evening news, a quiet petition landed on the clerk's desk at the Mecklenburg County Courthouse. It didn't come from a major organization, but from an anonymous group of citizens, teachers, social workers, students, veterans. The petition didn't ask for Maddox's sentence to be extended, nor for more people to be prosecuted. They wanted one thing only: full disclosure of all internal complaints that had been buried by the Charlotte Police Department over the past decade. Attached was a list of more than 40 individuals who had filed complaints, but never received a formal response. Some had passed away, some had moved out of state, but all had left a trace, a sign that they once spoke up and were once deemed not important enough to be heard. When Malik heard the news from Bird, he didn't seem surprised. He only asked, "What about the ones who never filed a complaint?" Bird went quiet. She knew the real number wasn't in the 40 names on the list, but in the hundreds who had been stopped on the street, asked why they were walking through a wealthy neighborhood, or had their IDs scrutinized like a ticket just to exist. Those who didn't know how to file a complaint, or no longer had the patience elsewhere in the city. Inside a community center, Malik led an informal sharing session. 7 people sat in a circle, each with a story. One man recalled being pulled from his car just for driving through a sensitive area. A woman shared how she had been detained because she didn't speak fluent English. Malik didn't interrupt. He didn't explain the law. He only asked them 3 times. In that moment, "Who stood with you?" On the 3rd time, the room fell silent. No one had an answer, and that silence, that was what Malik wanted them to remember, so that next time it happened to someone else, they wouldn't stay silent again. At police headquarters, Boone was overseeing the audit of cases previously closed due to insufficient grounds for investigation. A staff member handed him a nearly 300-page bundle, old complaints. Boone flipped through a few and saw the familiar phrases. Lack of camera evidence. Officer acted on professional judgment. No clear signs of discrimination. What was most troubling wasn't the words, it was their numbing repetition, like pre-stamped labels for every wrong. Boone held one old form and exhaled. "I used to write the same, just to keep the files moving." A colleague asked, "And now?" Boone replied, "Now I want every one of those people to come back and hear us say they were right to feel it was unjust." At a university law symposium, Ava Choi was invited to speak alongside legal scholars. In her talk, she didn't mention Maddox. She didn't name Malik. Instead, she asked, "We have laws, we have protocols, we have processes. So why do people still feel fear when a police officer approaches?" She spoke of victims who stayed silent because they thought no one would believe them. Then she said, "My job isn't to make people believe my reporting is accurate. It's to make sure the system can't distort the truth without being seen." Meanwhile, outside the county courthouse, an elderly woman, small in stature, silver-haired, stepped out of the public service office. She had just refiled a complaint she originally submitted 8 years ago, one that was later misplaced. The young receptionist said, "I'm not sure this case can still be reviewed." Without hesitation, she replied, "I'm not here to be sure it'll be reviewed. I'm here to make sure it won't be buried again." That night, Malik saw a photo of her complaint posted on social media. Not by the press, but by a law student, with the caption, "I used to think justice was decided by degrees. Now I know it can be upheld by an old single mother." Malik saved the photo, not as documentation, but because he knew if silence was what let injustice linger, then this time, quiet acts like hers were what would keep justice from looking away. And the next morning, while finalizing the last packet of materials for the community groups, he handwrote the final line in steady blue ink. "We do not need to be respected for having endured. We need to be respected because, from now on, we will not endure it any longer." The trial concluded. Ryan Maddox was sentenced to 18 months in prison and 2 years of special supervision, permanently stripped of his right to serve in any law enforcement agency nationwide. It wasn't a landmark verdict, nor a precedent-shattering case, but it marked a turning point. For the first time, an officer was prosecuted not for procedural error, but for a skewed motive rooted in racial bias. The court didn't shout, but in the verdict, one line left many in silence. Bias is not invisible. It can press so heavily on someone's neck that they kneel, not for guilt, but for the color of their skin. The press reported it just enough. No sensational headlines, no rallying cries. There was nothing left to ignite. People had seen it all already. But in the local news broadcasts, for the first time, neither Maddox nor Malik appeared on screen. Instead, a blank white slide with a single black sentence. Have we done enough to ensure there won't be a next time? Malik didn't attend the hearing. He spent that morning walking the old streets, where he had grown up, gone to war, returned, and lived a quiet post-military life. He stopped at a small auto repair shop on South Tryon Street, where the owner, a Haitian immigrant, had once been shoved to the ground by Maddox during a suspicious behavior check. The owner recognized him. He didn't say thank you, just handed him a glass of iced lemonade. Malik took a sip and said, "Not because you deserved to be treated that way, just because someone thought no one would stand up for you." The man simply nodded. "Now, I know someone saw it. That same day at a police academy training class in Charlotte, new officers were given a scenario. A citizen refuses to show ID and asks for a lawyer. For the first time, the suggested response was not, apply legal force. Instead, a question, if they're right, will you step back? A rookie raised his hand. If I step back, does that make me weak? The instructor, a former officer who had once stayed silent during the Maddox incident, replied, no, but if you don't step back when you know you're wrong, you're not strong, you're dangerous. Byrd was finalizing a systemic impact report on the case, not by mandate but out of a sense of duty. In the report was a sobering graph. The number of internal complaints resubmitted in the 60 days following Maddox's arrest had risen by nearly 200%, not because policing had worsened, but because people now believed they had the right to speak, and someone would listen. At the end of the report, Byrd wrote, "We don't need a department that is loved. We need a department that is monitored and corrected in time." As for Boone, after dozens of closed-door meetings, more than he'd spent patrolling the streets, he finally received a proposal from the Department of Justice to pilot bias evaluation models across 7 states, using his program as the framework. When asked if he wanted to put his name on the initiative, he shook his head. "I didn't write this to get credit. I wrote it because last time I stayed silent, and this time I don't want my kid growing up thinking that's normal." On a Sunday afternoon, Malik and Elijah sat on a bench at Revolution Park. They watched a group of kids playing basketball. Neither spoke for 10 minutes. Then Elijah asked, "Do you think it's over now?" Malik answered without hesitation, "It's over for Maddox, but not for the ones who still think like him. Just because no cameras caught them yet, just because no cameras caught them yet, just because no cameras caught them yet, just because no cameras caught them yet. Neighborhoods and elementary," Malik answered, without hesitation. But as they left the park, he turned back and whispered, "I think justice doesn't need to win, it just needs not to retreat." That night, at a small gathering of a local church group, Pastor Jackson, the man who had once officiated Malik's wedding, read a short quote from one of Dr. King's old speeches, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Then he added, "Justice with no one beside it is just theory, but one man standing still, like Jefferson, can force that theory to take to the streets." Malik, when mentioned by name, showed no reaction. He didn't need a title. He had once told Boone, "I don't want to be the spokesperson for pain. I just don't want anyone else to grit their teeth in silence, thinking no one sees them." And for him, that was reward enough. In the wooden drawer next to his desk, along with copies of complaint forms and thank you letters. There was now a small box containing handwritten notes from people who gave no name, no return address. One wrote, "The first time I saw someone not lower his head, I raised mine too." Another, "I never thought I'd write to someone who wore a uniform, but you made me rethink what honor really means." Malik didn't reply. He'll record names. He just kept them, because sometimes the most needed thing isn't a response, but someone willing to listen. 1 month after Maddox's trial, Charlotte no longer roared, but beneath the calm surface the city was still shedding its skin. Slowly, but truly. There were no more banners, no mass gatherings, yet people seemed to walk with more intention, as if the upheaval hadn't just changed policy, but had exposed an uncomfortable truth, that justice had once been selective, reserved for those with the right skin color, the right tone, the right face, the right voice. At a community center in West End, Malik sat with a small group, 5 people, all of whom had experienced some form of harassment or unwarranted police stop. They weren't media-sized victims. They were workers, nurses, teachers, students, fathers, and mothers. A middle-aged man recounted being pulled from his car while rushing his child to the hospital. No apology. No report. The woman beside him quietly added, "I used to think it was my fault for not being gentle enough when I got stopped." Malik didn't lecture. He didn't comfort. He just said, "Their suspicion isn't proof of your wrongdoing. It's just their version of the truth. And now, what we need is to make our truth the official record." Elijah, after his essay circulated among faculty, was invited to speak at an orientation for incoming students. The principal asked him to share his thoughts on civic responsibility. Elijah stood before over 100 peers and spoke briefly. "We shouldn't wait until someone we love gets pulled by the wrist to start caring about right and wrong. We don't need someone to hold a title to deserve respect. But we must remember, some people can't speak for themselves, and if we don't help them be heard, will eventually end up right where they are." There was no applause. But in later conversations, that line became a reference point. At the same time, Byrd, now holding a pivotal role in the reform task force, led a closed-door conference with police departments from nearby districts. The agenda wasn't reform, but restructuring personal accountability within the command chain. More bluntly, who approved what, who edited records, who saw but said nothing. The meeting wasn't pleasant. Some attendees were uneasy. One said, "We're turning the whole force into suspects." Byrd didn't argue. She only asked, "If recording responsibility clearly makes someone uncomfortable, is the problem in the system or in them?" As for Boone, during a policy workshop with state advisors, he presented the unconscious behavior review model. He didn't use jargon. Instead, he shared the first time he hesitated to stop someone without a solid reason. "When I looked at him, I saw danger. Not because he did anything wrong, but because I had been trained to fear people who looked like him. No one laughed, no one frowned. Some took note, some stayed still. When he finished, the moderator said, 'That's the first time I've heard an officer admit not just the error, but the emotional roots that gave birth to it.'" Malik wasn't at those meetings. He visited the home of a mother whose son had been unlawfully detained 3 years ago, just to hand her a reprocessed copy of her complaint. She didn't cry. She didn't thank him. She held the document, read it carefully, and said, "I should have had this 3 years ago, but maybe if I'd gotten it sooner, I wouldn't understand its full meaning like I do now." Malik nodded. Justice arriving late isn't always meaningless. It still matters if it stops the next wrong. That evening, at the cemetery, he returned to the old unmarked grave he had visited before. This time, he brought a small stone etched with the words, "I saw. I did not look away." He placed it on the ground beside the nameless headstone. No one witnessed it. No one needed to. But it's actions like that, with no medals, no cameras, that help keep a person's spine straight when the whole world still leans Northway. And as the city kept spinning, traffic jams persisted, newscasts rolled on, budgets were debated, a quiet shift was spreading. Everyone who had seen Malik stand still that day was now figuring out how to stand, right when it was their turn, not to be him, not to follow him, but because they knew if no one acts, everything will repeat as if nothing ever happened. Winter settled over Charlotte. No thick snow like in the north, but cold enough that people shrugged their shoulders as they passed each other on the street. In that chill, something new began to take shape. Not obvious, not flashy, but anyone who had lived long enough in the city could feel it. A different kind of order, not enforced, but emerging from how people now looked at one another. Not everyone had changed, but for the first time, change didn't need someone standing in the street shouting to take effect. At a public elementary school, a black teacher asked her third graders to draw heroes without capes. One boy drew a silver-haired man in a long coat standing at a gas station. When the teacher asked who it was, he replied, "I don't know his name." But he didn't hit anyone, he didn't yell, he just stood there, and he made the whole country stop. There was no need to redefine strength. The children understood it, in their own simple but precise way. At a Department of Justice industry conference in Atlanta, Bird was one of 3 special guests in a panel titled, "When Power Goes Unchecked, Lessons from Within." She didn't talk about Maddox. She didn't mention Malik. She only shared one conclusion drawn from 3 decades on the job. If a system needs outsiders to speak up before it corrects itself, then it's not a system, it's a cage. The quote was reposted widely on but Bird knew the real value wasn't in the phrasing. It was in saying it aloud, no longer having to whisper it behind closed doors. Boone continued coordinating reform across counties, but he no longer had to convince each person that change was necessary. He was now invited because his presence meant things wouldn't be done just for show. During a review in Fayetteville County, a veteran officer asked, "If we keep checking on each other, will anyone be left who trusts enough to do the job?" Boone didn't respond with theory. He recalled a 2021 patrol when a young officer pointed out that Boone had forgotten to review the body cam footage before submitting his report. "I corrected it, and thanks to him, that day's report wasn't misleading." He concluded, "We don't need blind trust. We need enough respect to correct each other and still want to work together." As for Malik, he didn't appear in the news, wasn't cited in official reports, and didn't claim to represent any advocacy group. But one late evening he received a letter from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, not to speak, not to be honored, but to attend a special class for graduating cadets titled, "When Moral Orders Override Rank." The letter simply read, "We want them to meet someone who once followed orders, but also once forced a system to re-examine the orders it gave." Malik hadn't responded. He placed the letter in the drawer beside his desk, where he kept things he wasn't ready to handle yet. Then he continued working on a draft curriculum for a basic civics program, material he and Elijah were developing for middle school students. This time, it didn't start with rights. It started with a question. When you see something wrong happening, what is the first thing you will do? Elijah suggested, "Should we add some options they can check off?" Malik shook his head slowly. "No, this one. Each person has to write their own answer." Outside, the wind picked up. Some trees bent sharply, but the door didn't rattle. The house stood firm, just like a man who once stood, not because he was protected, but because he had learned how to hold himself upright without needing permission. And just like that, the story didn't end. It was only now beginning, exactly the way it always should have, quiet, steady, and without waiting for anyone's approval. As winter passed, and the first spring rains washed over Charlotte, the city no longer spoke much of Malik Jefferson. But that didn't mean he disappeared. On the contrary, silence became proof that what he left behind was no longer a wave, it had become a foundation. Rather than being splashed across headlines, his name came up in hallway conversations at government offices, in public ethics exams, and in father-son dinner table talks no one ever recorded. At a small community center in the Belmont neighborhood, Elijah led his first session for high school students, a pilot program titled Rights and Moral Reflexes When Facing Law Enforcement. He didn't begin with a lecture. He handed each student a blank sheet of paper and wrote one question on the board. When you're not wrong but still suspected, how do you protect yourself without losing yourself? There was no correct answer. But each response read aloud proved one thing: young people are not unconscious. They just need to be trusted that their response matters more than their submission. In a closed-door meeting of police chiefs from southern counties, Boone presented a report summarizing 6 months of periodic review procedures. One line caused the entire room to fall silent. Among over 500 civilian complaints in the past 5 years, marked insufficient grounds for investigation, 118 received no follow-up, meaning they were silenced not with evidence, but with erasure. Boone paused, then added, "We used to say we didn't follow up because we lacked staff or time, but the truth is, we lacked the courage to face the discomfort truth brings." No one argued. A senior official from Greenville nodded and said, "I used to think it was enough for the public to believe we were fair, but now I understand. Fairness isn't something people should have to believe. It's something they must be able to see." As for Malik, he continued the role even he didn't name, guiding those who didn't know where to start. At a small meeting with residents along Beatty's Ford Road, a middle-aged woman asked, "Do you think what happened to you could happen again?" He replied slowly, "I don't think it'll never happen again. But next time, someone will know they're not alone. And sometimes that's enough to change the direction of everything." A few days later, he and Elijah visited Fort Liberty, the old military base where Malik had spent nearly half his service. The main gate still bore its weathered brass sign, and the old oak tree by the entrance stood like a silent witness. As they walked the training grounds, Elijah asked, "Did you ever think that if you had yelled or resisted that day, maybe people would have realized the truth sooner?" Well, he paused. "Yes, and I also thought, if I had done that, they might have seen what was wrong, but they wouldn't have heard what was right." The boy nodded, quietly, then said, "I think I get it. Yelling makes people back away, but standing still the right way makes them come closer." Later that day, they visited the base's administrative hall, where portraits of former officers lined the walls. Malik didn't look for his own. He stood before a portrait of an old comrade, the man who had saved him in an ambush in Iraq and died a week later. Malik whispered, "If you were alive, maybe you'd tell me not to try fixing the whole system, but I believe you'd still be the first to step forward if you saw me in cuffs." Elijah stood beside him, saying nothing. A new generation, learning to view the past not to glorify or judge, but to preserve what's right before memory fades. And just like that, the story was no longer about a man who was wrongly handcuffed. It had become a question every future generation must learn to answer in their own way. When something wrong happens, in the street, in an office, or in the heart of a community, who will be the one not to look away? Thank you for following this story to its final moment. If you feel that what you've just read was more than a headline, if something in it touched a corner of your heart, please don't let it scroll past like just another clip in an endless feed. Pause for a moment, leave a comment. It doesn't need to be long, it doesn't need to be poetic, just your honest thoughts. Have you ever been in a similar situation? Have you ever felt your silence was a form of complicity? Or maybe you just want to say, "I understand." Each share from you helps us spread meaningful content and creates a space where those who've been silent will see that they are no longer alone. We create these stories not for views, but because we believe telling the right thing, even something small, can change the way someone sees themselves. If you find value in that, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Help us keep telling stories worth telling. Help us keep the fire alive for those voices that people once thought no one wanted to hear. You're helping the truth stay alive, and for us, that's more than enough to keep going.